Good afternoon. Last October the 11th, I had the opportunity to defend my PhD. Now I can say it's kind of like having a higher state of ignorance, really. But my PhD research is on the social dynamics of language and gender, specifically neuroscience and perception management. So being a neuroscientist, I suppose right now I'm triggering a little something in your brains since I've switched to English. I trust that's not a problem. Soy canadiense de nacimiento, pero catalana de tot cor. So, my PhD research. I would like to provide some insights today on the 1.3 kilo mass between your ears, which is your brain. And this is made up of soft tissue, of blood cells, of water, blood vessels, and fat. Actually, it's 60% fat. And this mass, of which we know very little about, is our most complex organ. And this organ works in beautiful synchronicity with over 100 muscles in your face, your lips, your throat, and your jaw to produce a puff of air that comes out of your mouth. And that's language. And language is probably one of the most powerful things you can have for professional skills, for credibility, and for success. Here's where it gets interesting. Language has two roles, and much of how we infer judgments from each other is much in the way of how we present ourselves. And in how we present ourselves, we draw perceptions mainly from body language, but also from talk. And this idea of talk is a very powerful insight into language and how language can lead to perceptions. Now, communication is not as simple as saying what you mean. We mean a lot more than what we say. And here's where neuroscience gets very, very interesting when we look at professional women across industry who struggle to be heard, who struggle to be heard in what I like to call high-octane meetings, where they are the one or one of the only women at the table, and with confidence, as we saw earlier. Now, confidence is a very easy thing to say, but how and where can we generate this confidence, this perception of confidence through language? And this is these linguistic strategies from neuroscience and these internal triggers of our brains, of which I'd like to share insights with you from my research and from subsequent research that I've done. We cannot scan two people, even two people sitting in this room, and take that MRI scan and see who's going to be the better leader. It's impossible. We can't do that. So a lot of the internal triggers which drive our behavior and drive our decisions and which lead to perceptions is actually not as rational as we like to think. In the same way right now, you're probably not aware of the shoes on your feet. Emotions is something that are always present, but we're not aware of until we have a very high stakes or tense situation, like speaking here, or a PhD defense, or perhaps a job interview, or a promotion. So we like to believe that our business decisions or professional decisions are very bias-free and very rational. And that could not be farther from the truth. So, where do perceptions come from? Number one, body language. The part of your brain, if you trace your finger at the back of your neck where your skull begins, we have an area of the brain that's sometimes called the reptilian brain or the old brain. And this area is actually 5 million years older than our rational prefrontal cortex. In other words, if you try to divorce any emotional part or socialization part of connection from your message, it's not going to work. Because the emotional brain gets the first vote. But isn't that strange that we find that in professional situations we have to extract emotion? I just congratulated Joanna. I think it's fantastic she showed emotion. Because you know what? You're going to remember her. And we do. Perceptions. Now, here's where it gets interesting about how our brains work, how neuroscience fits into it, and perceptions of women and men in STEM or beyond in leadership positions or decision-making positions. How do we view men and women when it comes to ethical failures in companies? A very interesting study here showed that after an ethical failure of a company, people are less likely to remain loyal and to back that company if that ethical failure had a woman behind it at the decision-making role. Why? So here's where it gets even more interesting about perceptions. And we saw this a little bit this morning with Mercé, with the alpha and omega, these kinds of expectations we have that men are more competitive and women have more communal traits. So what I would like to suggest is that from a language perspective, language and something called linguistic styles has a lot to do with how perceptions are managed. So let's go into language. Back in 2018 with Harvard Business Review, we had an opportunity to take 81,000 performance reviews. And of these participants, we gave them 89 attributes, positive ones and negative ones. 89. 89 positive, 89 negative to everyone. And we said, okay, describe a leader. Describe a male leader, a good one, a great one. And describe a male leader who is not great. Describe a female leader who is incredible, excellent, you would follow her anywhere. And now describe a female leader in negative terms. She's not so great. Here's what we found. Out of the 89 attributes, men and women chose these top ones for him. He is the best leader. He is analytical, competent, for some reason, athletic, and trustworthy, okay? This is men and women, mind you. This is not just men, all right? This is how we all, out of those 89, describe an excellent male leader. Right, positively. Here's negative. Out of 89, statistically, the top 2 were arrogant and irresponsible. Now, if someone is arrogant and irresponsible, he, in this case, might be very difficult to collaborate and work with, but is clearly competent to get the job done. These attributes do not question his skill, his expertise, and therefore his competence. With women, however, we saw a very different picture. Top of the 89. She is competent in being compassionate, enthusiastic, energetic, and the number one out of all of them was she's organized. Maybe it has to do with all these lists. I don't know. I do lists, so I can't say. Now, it's a very different picture, however, we're speaking about perceptions and we're speaking about language when we look to the negative attributes that all of these 81,000 men and women described her. here she is. She's inept, frivolous, talkative, nervous, temperamental, emotional, and indecisive. Now, who in their right mind would describe a leader like this? This clearly questions ability. This clearly questions whether she is able to get the job done. Now, there are a lot of readings into this from a lot of different disciplines, but as a neuroscientist, I would like to offer you perspective from language. And the reason why is because, let me begin with Dr. Tannen. Dr. Tannen was a woman who personally has influenced me a lot when I kicked off my PhD research, about 8 years ago. Back in the 70s, Dr. Tannen investigated how we are socialized as boys and girls. I'll repeat that. How we're socialized has real-life implications in our behavior, in our professional lives, and in the language we use. All right? And there's a reason for this. You see, language is learned social behavior. When we are born, we're not born with language. Our brains are born with the potential for language. So the way we are socialized also teaches us a lot about dynamics, social dynamics, and how to use language to relate to each other and to get things done. Because if we take language, we cannot separate it from the social. Language negotiates our relationships. And by language, I refer to verbal, nonverbal, sign language, anything. We need language to negotiate our relationships. You cannot separate those two things. But language has two roles. Number one, language gets the ideas across. It gets these submarines built for under-oceanic exploration. It takes us to Mars. It develops the newest ways of road transportation for the future. But here's the neuroscience part of it. Language has a second, more invisible role, and that is language negotiates perceptions of competence and confidence. And here's where we see women are at a disadvantage. And I'd like to describe to you how the gender of language affects a lot the social dynamics, especially in STEM fields. Dr. Deborah Tannen, and my research as well, points to the way women use language. So when we're socialized as girls, and I speak very broadly, girls are socialized to get along, preserve the group dynamics, don't be bossy, and to be understood by the other members of the group. I mean, we like that. We aim for understanding. Whereas boys, on the other hand, are socialized to talk up their achievements to each other, and they're rewarded by their peers to talk up to their achievements. I did this, and then I went there, and then I went that. And they're very sensitive, more sensitive, to the power dynamic in the group. All you have to do is watch a group of children play. And up to a certain age, we tend to stick to our own gender, and it's very easy to observe. So the way girls play and the way boys play is very different. The way we use language is also very different. And language is learned social behavior. So we see that the way men and women use language leads to a lot of perception. And again, we like to believe that we're very unbiased and rational when we judge other people. So if I ask anybody here, what does a confident person sound like? Probably you would all trust your judgment of who's confident and who's not. But in STEM fields particularly, where women are outnumbered and still continue to be outnumbered, although progress is here, we see that male decision makers are judging their female counterparts by their own linguistic norms. Because this is bias, and we're all biased. The more you are similar to me, the more I will be likely to agree with you. And the more different you are to me, the more likely I am to disagree with you. So, here's where Dr. Tannen and myself investigated something called linguistic style. And linguistic style is the characteristic speaking pattern that we all have. Pauses, compliments, interrupting. the speed, the rhythm, apologies. All of these kinds of things are learned and differ between men and between women. And I'd like to give you a few examples to shed light, hopefully, on how perhaps unintended signals are being generated through the way you're using language. Women, we, tend to aim more for rapport talk. All right? So when we investigated this, we see that women like and prefer to speak more in private contexts, that we aim for understanding, and that we have certain conversational rituals that men simply don't share. It's not because it's better or worse or us versus them, it's just we're different. Socialized differently, language is different. And men, we refer to it as more report talk. So they get more airtime in general, A, because statistically we are outnumbered, and B, because men, have more linguistic styles which aim in a different way when it comes to interrupting, expressing views, talking about achievement. So who gets the credit? Here's an example of linguistic style. The linguistic strategy of a pronoun can send different signals to how people will see you. And that pronoun is I or we. Men, because, and according to Dr. Tannen again, use 43% more the pronoun I than women do. And women at that high-octane meeting where she spearheaded that project will cross her fingers and be hoping in vain that people understood that she was responsible, even though she will say, well, we, deferring to her team. And then she'll get very frustrated. And then if the decision maker at that table is rewarding linguistic styles similar to his own, he has two different very perceptions. Someone very confident with an I and a we. So who gets the credit? Questions is another example of linguistic style. Women have no problem asking questions. None. We ask a lot of questions, and we will continue to ask until it's clear. We will actually probably enjoy it. And the way I would ask a question would be, well, okay, Mars, but I don't understand how the laws or currency are going to work on Mars. How is that going to happen? And I will ask, and I will enjoy that because we aim for understanding, rapport. However, the possible discrediting role of a question for a man will be very different. And oftentimes when we did studies, we observed that the way a man will ask a question is very different with respect to my male colleagues here. He will probably say, well, you didn't explain A, B, and C. Could you go back and do that again, please? Now, perhaps it's the same question, but because men tend to be socially very more sensitive than we are to this power status in the room, questions may actually send unintended signals of weakness and that I don't know. And we also see that they like to find their own way. So, apologizing is another area of linguistic style which can lead to perceptions. Women apologize, and as a Canadian, we apologize a lot. We're always apologizing. If ever you know a Canadian, we're always saying we're sorry in about 12 different ways. Now, it's interesting because the way women use apologies does not necessarily mean I accept the blame. It actually probably means I'm showing empathy. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Tell me what happened. How can I help? So women use apologies, but it's not literal, I am to blame. It is a linguistic strategy to establish rapport, connection, and show empathy. Men do not share this. So if we go back to that high-octane meeting and we see someone using we a lot and apologizing a lot, they're starting to send out these signals, very unintended, of her competence and her confidence. So, this is subject to further interpretation, but I have read together with Dr. Tannen that women apologize more often than men, it is said because we have a lower threshold of what we tend to think is offensive. Now, I'm not sure if that is true, but excessive apologizing or apologizing in contrast to people in the room who do not can send these signals and generate a perception that perhaps we're not even aware of. Verbal opposition now, I move to a male linguistic style, and some women too. This isn't 100%. Verbal opposition is throwing the idea down at the table and openly inviting resistance and criticism to stress test ideas. Voices are raised, interruptions are happening, and it is a very male feature of linguistic style. If you were to walk into a boardroom with 12 women at the table screaming at the top of their lungs, that would be a fight. But we see that raised voices and challenge of ideas is expected and welcome as a linguistic style, which men share, women do not. And sometimes we watch the men leave the room happy, having a beer, having a coffee, and we're mystified. But how did you do that after that fight? Well, it wasn't a fight. It's different. Women don't do this. We don't share it. We don't have a need. It's just not part of how we use language. So, men or women, if you're the kind of person who is very uncomfortable, especially with interrupting is a big one. If you're uncomfortable with interrupting, raising your voice and making yourself heard, you do run the risk of being perceived, and I talk about perception, of being insecure about your ideas and overlooked for that promotion. Now, we saw this earlier, and I'll say it again. Over and over and over, when I have the amazing opportunity to work with the most incredible women, from Microsoft and Women to the European Network of Women Engineers to Wider Telefonica, where I regularly collaborate, and I show women how this works. And I tell them we need to add muscle to your conversation. It's not that you have to adapt a masculine style, it's that you have to open up and realize the way you say something generates a perception, and it matters. So, it is very simple. This perception management is really what ultimately drives behaviors and decisions. More importantly, and I go back down to this area of the brain that is so old, habits, values, and beliefs are really at the core of all of our decisions that we make. And knowing people's habits is a competitive advantage because we don't change our habits very often. And to end with this, as a linguist, and I love language, and I'm fascinated by the power of it, I often say to my 3 daughters, the most important voice you will ever hear is the one inside your head. I wish you incredible success, and think about there is no one way to have a conversation, and that is true diversity in any field. Thank you.